April 8, 217 AD. The sun barely touches the marble walls of the Baths of Caracalla, that architectural colossus which promised pleasure, rest, and prestige to Rome's elite. But this morning there will be no laughter, no political debates. In less than an hour, the empire's most luxurious complex will become the stage for one of the most calculated and silent massacres in history. The mosaics that once reflected the grandeur of the gods will witness something very different, the paranoia of an emperor turning a sanctuary of well-being into a chamber of political death. What you are about to hear is neither legend nor exaggeration, these are facts recorded in ancient chronicles and confirmed by modern archaeology. A story where distrust became a weapon, and the world's most advanced civilization revealed its most brutal face. If you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of Rome, subscribe now and leave a like. This time, history will not be a mirror of glory, but of fear. To understand what happened at dawn at the Baths, we must go back 2 months in time. April of 217, Caracalla, son of Septimius Severus, an emperor feared for his cruelty and admired for his military might, was assassinated during a campaign in Mesopotamia. The direct hand was that of Marcus Opellius Macrinus, Praetorian prefect, a man of humble origin who had risen through the ranks not by bloodline, but through administrative cunning and a cold talent for intrigue. Caracalla's death was not an outburst, but a meticulously orchestrated conspiracy. Several senators, patricians, and generals worked in the shadows, contributing money, intelligence, and connections. And although history remembers Macrinus as the assassin, he did not act alone, behind him stood an entire network of accomplices. Yet the fate of conspirators rarely ends in loyalty. Once crowned emperor, Macrinus faced a mortal dilemma, those who had been his allies yesterday now knew too much. They knew the details of the ambush, the names of the conspirators, the betrayals that had cleared the path to power. Distrust turned into obsession. Macrinus began to see traitors at every corner, shadows conspiring even in his most private halls. And like every usurper, he understood a cruel truth: spilled blood demands more blood to sustain power. Rome, outwardly calm, was in reality suspended over an abyss of suspicion. At the heart of this tension, Macrinus began to draw up a plan to erase his former allies in a single stroke, in a place as symbolic as it was lethal, the Baths of Caracalla. On April 8, before the city awoke, 15 of the most influential men of Rome received orders to discreetly present themselves at the empire's most famous bathing complex. The summons bore the imperial seal, a state meeting to discuss the first steps of the new government. The men summoned represented the cream of the aristocracy. Lucius Cornelius Scipio, descendant of the heroes who had defeated Hannibal. Gaius Fulvius Plautianus, a trade magnate who moved fortunes rivaling the public treasury. Marcus Flavius Cordus, a veteran of the Germanic campaigns, hardened in 100 battles. And the youngest, Marcus Opellius Macrinus Jr., nephew of the emperor himself, an inconvenient witness to the conspiracy that had ended Caracalla's life. Each name represented a distinct danger: wealth, lineage, political influence, or simply too much knowledge. Macrinus had not summoned them to hear their advice, but to pronounce their sentence. The Baths of Caracalla were the perfect stage. Their monumental architecture offered multiple entrances, allowing the Praetorians to deploy unseen. The vaulted ceilings would swallow every cry, and the drains would serve to make the evidence vanish. Where others saw a temple of luxury, Macrinus saw a slaughterhouse carefully designed. The patricians arrived one by one, dressed in their finest togas, convinced they were attending a historic council. Some carried scrolls with proposals, others family seals to authenticate agreements. None suspected they were walking into the last hour of their lives. When the group was complete in the central caldarium, surrounded by marble columns and mosaics gleaming under the pale light of dawn, the silence grew suffocating. The steam from the pools rose like a veil concealing invisible presences. And then, a metallic crash announced the closing of the doors. The trap was sealed. The metallic thunder of the doors echoed like an omen. The sound spread through the vault of the caldarium until everything fell into tense silence. It was then that, from the side corridors, 50 Praetorians emerged in tight formation. They carried no swords or spears, but wore hammers, tools more fit for executioners than for soldiers. The patricians understood at once the true nature of the meeting. Some instinctively recoiled until they struck against the marble columns, others searched for exits already blocked by interlocked shields. The air, once warm with the steam of the pools, became suffocating, almost unbreathable. The centurion commanding the operation, Marcus Junius Brutus Tertius, a veteran hardened by 2 decades of campaigns, stepped forward. With a grave voice and without hesitation, he pronounced the sentence. By order of Emperor Macrinus, you have conspired against Rome. The penalty is death, and death will be slow. The first to raise his voice was Marcus Opellius Macrinus Jr. The emperor's nephew demanded to speak with his uncle, convinced that his kinship would save him. But his protest only provoked the order to begin the execution with him. Family blood was now the clearest message, no bond stood above imperial will. A hammer came crashing down on his skull, and the dull sound reverberated through the hall like the toll of a funeral bell. The mosaics depicting the Olympian gods were stained with the first spatter of blood. Luxury had become the stage of horror. Panic erupted. Lucius Cornelius Scipio, living symbol of republican greatness, demanded a trial before the Senate. His plea was answered with a blow that struck him down beside the pool, where the water began to turn red. The Republic had died centuries ago, the emperor was now judge, jury, and executioner. Some tried to negotiate, others resisted, and a few collapsed in fear before receiving the first blow. But all understood that the caldarium of the baths had become their tomb. The massacre had only just begun. The caldarium became a ritual slaughterhouse. The steam from the pools, now mingled with blood, created a thick fog that barely allowed the silhouettes of bodies to be distinguished. The hammers descended with methodical precision, blow after blow, in a symphony of cracking bones and muffled screams. Gaius Fulvius Plautianus, the wealthy merchant magnate, tried to buy his life by offering fortunes that could have enriched an entire regiment. The soldiers remained unmoved. The order was clear, no bribe, no bargain. His shoulder was shattered with the first blow, and his curse against Macrinus was lost among the echoes of marble. Marcus Flavius Cordus, a veteran of Germania, was the only one to show real resistance. With his fractured arm, he tore a hammer from the hands of an executioner and managed to split the skull of a praetorian before being surrounded and beaten down. His brief rebellion did not change the outcome, but it was recorded in testimonies as a final act of dignity. The youngest, Quintus Fabius Vibulanus, barely 19, was forced to watch the massacre until the end. His childish cries for his mother contrasted with the cold discipline of the executioners. They left him alive deliberately, to witness every execution and understand the fate awaiting him. Only when the last of his companions had fallen did they deliver the final blow. The marble floor was unrecognizable. The water of the pools, designed for purification and leisure, had become a crimson mirror where scraps of toga and fragments of bone floated. The mosaics that once depicted mythological scenes of gods and heroes now seemed to mock the condemned, covered by red puddles slowly spilling into the drains. For 47 minutes, the Praetorians worked like professional executioners, ensuring none escaped their sentence. When the last body fell, the silence left behind was more terrifying than the screams that had preceded it. But the massacre was not over. The worst was yet to come. When the final scream faded beneath the marble dome, Centurion Brutus Tertius raised his hand to begin the second phase of the operation. Macrinus's order was unequivocal: the bodies had to be unrecognizable. It was not enough to kill, each patrician's identity had to be erased, their memory torn from the face of Rome. For nearly 2 hours, the Praetorians struck the corpses with chilling detachment. Skulls reduced to dust, faces turned into irreparable masks, torsos ripped open to expose their organs. Only the signet rings were preserved, carefully removed from bloodied fingers. They would be the sole proof of who had been there, and the only trophies Macrinus allowed to survive. The caldarium became an apocalyptic stage: shattered mosaics, stained columns, pools of blood running into drains meant for thermal water. The steam, mingled with the metallic stench of blood, filled the air so thickly that the soldiers had to cover their mouths with wine-soaked cloths to endure it. 3 days later, the cleanup began. More than 100 slaves, brought from the slaughterhouses of the suburbs, were forced to work without rest under threat of death. They used acids imported from Egypt to dissolve blood embedded in the marble, while human remains were carted away to cremation furnaces on the outskirts of Rome. There, the ashes were mixed with quicklime and dumped into the Tiber, scattering forever any physical trace of the slain. On the surface, the baths seemed intact. The mosaics gleamed, the marble shone, and the pools once again flowed clean with water. But beneath that facade, all of Rome began to suspect. Macrinus already had his official version ready. The Patricians had been conspirators, and their execution had saved the empire from civil war. A lie as calculated as the massacre itself. On the surface, Macrinus' strategy had seemed flawless. The bodies destroyed, the ashes scattered in the Tiber, the mosaics gleaming after days of cleaning. But there was one detail impossible to hide: the simultaneous disappearance of 15 of the most powerful men in Rome. In the Senate, the empty seats were impossible to disguise. The names of families that had shaped the history of the Republic ceased to be spoken in the sessions. Rumors spread like wildfire. How could so many patricians vanish on the same night without leaving a trace? Macrinus reacted quickly. 3 days after the massacre, he circulated imperial edicts across all the provinces. According to the official version, the 15 men had been discovered plotting a coup to restore the Severan dynasty. Their deaths were presented as a preventive execution, an act of defense for the empire. In the forums, imperial heralds read the documents aloud before bewildered crowds. The edicts included forged letters, allegedly found among the possessions of the executed men, detailing bribes to legions and pacts with provincial governors. A carefully crafted farce, but one that did not deceive everyone. The families of the victims began to move in secret. They bribed slaves, interrogated merchants who had witnessed unusual military movements that morning, and gathered pieces that gradually painted a sinister picture. Some even managed to recover objects hidden by the cleaning slaves: fragments of blood-stained cloth, pieces of rings, locks of hair that could be recognized. Among the most outraged voices emerged a key figure, Julia Domna, mother of Caracalla, who had returned to Rome weeks after the massacre. Her network of informants, stretching from Alexandria to Antioch, began reconstructing what had happened that morning. Each detail that surfaced made Macrinus' official version appear weaker. The emperor sensed it. His paranoia grew unbearable. He began executing anyone who asked too many questions, eliminating slaves and minor officials merely on suspicion of having witnessed something. Instead of consolidating his power, his obsessive behavior made his guilt all the more evident. All of Rome smelled the blood behind the walls of the baths, even if the marble shone again. And every silence imposed by force only increased the suspicions. While Rome was still struggling to digest the disappearance of 15 patricians, a mind in the shadows began weaving the net that would seal Macrinus' fate: Julia Maesa, sister of Julia Domna and aunt of Caracalla. From her exile in Maesa, in Syria, she calmly observed the weakness of the new emperor. Maesa was the complete opposite of Macrinus. He ruled with fear and paranoia, she, with patience and cold calculation. She had witnessed Caracalla's brutality, his assassination, and now the massacre in the baths. And she understood something few others grasped: Macrinus had committed the unforgivable error of any usurper, killing his own allies before consolidating power. The aristocratic families who had lost their leaders were searching for a banner, someone who could channel their rage and restore their honor. And Maesa was ready to offer them exactly that. Her plan revolved around a boy of barely 14, Varius Avitus Bassianus, her grandson, priest of the Syrian god Elgebal in Maesa. In a move as daring as it was dangerous, Maesa began spreading the idea that the youth was not merely a religious heir, but Caracalla's illegitimate son. A direct descendant of the Severan dynasty, still venerated by many in Rome. The rumors spread like fire through dry forest. For a humiliated aristocracy, that boy represented the perfect vengeance, the blood of Caracalla against the usurper who had not only murdered him, but also massacred those who had helped him rise to power. Macrinus, increasingly isolated, still did not perceive the magnitude of the enemy growing against him. He believed the brutality of the massacre at the baths had cemented his rule, but in truth he had sown the seeds of his downfall. The murmurs in the forums grew bolder. Some said, "The gods do not forgive the blood of the innocent." Others whispered, "Caracalla's ghost will return in the flesh of a new Caesar." What had begun as rumor soon transformed into a political movement with military reach. Julia Maesa was not only stirring the surviving patricians, she was also buying loyalties in the army. She knew the soldiers adored Caracalla, an emperor who had shared their campaigns, paid generous donatives, and promised rewards. In contrast, Macrinus was a bureaucrat with hands stained in aristocratic blood, but without the spark the legions revered. Rome was boiling. And while the marble of the baths still concealed the traces of the massacre, in Syria a counterattack was being prepared that would drag Macrinus to his grave. In the hills of Syria, far from Rome's immediate watch, Julia Maesa transformed aristocratic outrage into a project of revenge. The matriarch knew that rumors alone would not suffice; she needed to turn her grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, into the political and spiritual embodiment of Caracalla. The first step was to weave a myth. With the complicity of the priests of the Temple of Maesa, she began spreading the story that the young man was the product of a secret union between Caracalla and her daughter. Although impossible to verify, the tale perfectly fit popular desire, a legitimate heir of the Severan dynasty, born to avenge his father. The second step was money. Julia Maesa possessed a colossal fortune, amassed over years of influence in the palace. That gold began to flow to centurions and tribunes who nostalgically remembered Caracalla's generous gifts. Each bag of coins came with a poisoned message: "Macrinus stole your emperor, my grandson will return him to you." The third step was more subtle, winning over the widows and children of the patricians massacred in the baths. Wherever blood had left orphans, Maesa offered protection and promises of justice. Each grieving family became another echo that fueled the legend of Bassianus as the Avenger. The propaganda machine was so effective that, within a few months, soldiers and aristocrats began referring to the boy not by his name, but as Antoninus, a title that directly evoked the memory of Caracalla. Meanwhile, in Rome, Macrinus began hearing fragments of these rumors. Reports from his spies spoke of secret meetings in Maesa, tribunes quietly deserting, and gold coins bearing the image of a teenager who had never set foot in the capital. The emperor responded with the same medicine he had used in the baths: executions, purges, confiscations. But it was already too late. The legions in Syria, fed up with Macrinus's administrative rigidity and seduced by the promise of a Caesar who embodied Caracalla's blood, began swearing allegiance to Bassianus. The echo of that oath would soon reverberate throughout the empire. Rebellion was underway. And Macrinus, who had tried to secure his power with the most brutal massacre of the aristocracy, was about to face a far more relentless enemy, the memory of a dead emperor, resurrected in the figure of a 14-year-old boy. In the spring of 218, the winds of discontent turned into a storm. The legions stationed in Syria, the same that had marched under Caracalla's command, became the focal point of the rebellion. Soldiers hardened by campaigns in the east began receiving discreet visits from emissaries of Julia Maesa, who arrived with chests of gold and a carefully polished story. Caracalla lives in his son. And his son demands vengeance. The effect was immediate. The memory of the former emperor, with all his cruelties, was still associated with boundless generosity toward the soldiers. Caracalla had distributed gifts, promotions, and privileges, buying a love that survived his death. Compared to him, Macrinus was a dry bureaucrat, incapable of inspiring genuine loyalty. The first spark ignited at Raphania, a Syrian camp where tribunes publicly swore loyalty to Bassianus, proclaiming him emperor under the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, in honor of Caracalla. Soldiers raised their standards, stained their shields with the blood of sacrificed lambs, and shouted his name in a roar that echoed louder than any imperial decree. The news spread like fire through dry grass. Within weeks, the cohorts of Syria and Phoenicia joined the uprising. Even some garrisons in Egypt began showing signs of sympathy. It was a direct, frontal, and open challenge to Macrinus's power. The emperor, surprised by the speed of the contagion, tried to respond with the same brutality he had shown in Caracalla's baths. He ordered the immediate arrest of any senator or tribune who showed the slightest sympathy for Antoninus. He commanded the execution of alleged traitors in public forums to sow fear. But rather than extinguishing the fire, his punishments only fanned it. Meanwhile, Julia Maesa directed the rebellion from the shadows like a consummate strategist. Every message, every rumor, every bag of gold leaving Maesa was calibrated to reinforce the idea that Antoninus was the legitimate heir and Macrinus a dishonorable usurper. Rome was about to witness an inevitable clash, an emperor consumed by paranoia and a boy transformed into a symbol of hope and vengeance. And when the two forces met on the battlefield, the history of the empire changed forever. On June 8, 218, the plains near Antioch were painted with war banners. On one side, Emperor Macrinus, with around 50,000 men, including Praetorians and loyal legions, organized with impeccable discipline. On the other, an apparently inferior army, yet fueled by Julia Maesa's gold, faith in Antoninus, and nostalgia for Caracalla. Dawn brought an unsettling silence. The soldiers knew that what was at stake was not just imperial command, but the very direction of Rome. Macrinus went forward wearing golden armor, seeking to impose respect. Beside him, generals seasoned in Mesopotamian campaigns. But his voice lacked the strength an army needed to believe. In contrast, Antoninus, barely a teenager, was carried in a chariot, surrounded by priests of Elgabal, the solar god of Maesa. The young boy did not speak like a strategist, but like a chosen one, promising that the gods were on his side and that Rome would be purified of a usurper. His words, repeated by the soldiers, spread like a mystical echo. The clash was brutal. The infantry lines closed with the clang of iron and screams that tore through the morning. The Praetorians resisted with discipline, but soon desertion began. Entire cohorts, upon hearing Antoninus's name, threw down their weapons and switched sides. Macrinus, seeing his army crumble, tried to maintain formation, but panic was stronger. The fight turned into a massacre. Antoninus's supporters showed no mercy, surrendered soldiers were impaled without pity, and corpses carpeted the plain as proof of the accumulated fury. Amid the chaos, Macrinus made the decision that would seal his fate: he fled. He swapped his armor for a merchant's clothes, abandoned his men, and sought refuge on the roads to Asia Minor. But his escape was pathetic. Barely 3 days later, a centurion recognized him at an inn and handed him over to Antoninus's loyal troops. The end of the emperor who had ordered the massacre at the baths was neither bloody nor spectacular. He was quickly beheaded with a sword, no hammers, no humiliation, none of the cruelty he had designed for others. An ironically more honorable death than the one he had inflicted on his victims. His head, mounted on a spike, was taken to Rome as a trophy. His body, thrown into a mass grave, was forgotten like that of any ordinary criminal. With Macrinus's death, Rome received a new emperor barely 14 years old, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, later remembered as Elagabalus. His proclamation was immediate. Julia Maesa, the architect of this revenge, presented him as Caracalla's illegitimate son. A calculated lie, but powerful enough to inspire loyalty among the legions that still revered the memory of the slain emperor. The people, weary of uncertainty, accepted him without resistance. The Senate, humiliated after the massacre at the baths, hastened to swear allegiance to the new prince. No one dared publicly mention the crime committed in Caracalla's Caldarium, but in private, patrician families did not forget. Every banquet, every secret meeting in secluded villas, recalled the blood spilled on those marble walls. The echoes of the massacre had changed the political game forever. The aristocrats realized that no wealth, lineage, or ancestral prestige was enough to protect them from an emperor's paranoia. Confidence in the imperial system cracked, and that fracture would remain an open wound for generations. Julia Maesa, for her part, enjoyed the triumph with a coldness bordering on inhumanity. She had not only avenged her nephew Caracalla's death but had placed her grandson on the throne. From the shadows, she was now the most powerful woman in Rome. The new regime, however, was born marked by an original sin, the massacre of the Baths. Although officially presented as the elimination of traitors, another truth persisted in collective memory: Rome had witnessed an emperor massacring the very elite of the empire, and getting away with it, at least for a time. It was a chilling reminder that the blood spilled on the Caldarium's marble would never be fully cleaned, and that the fragility of power could turn any ally into an enemy overnight. Ancient chroniclers were quick to record what had happened. Herodian, a close witness to the events, described the sepulchral silence that fell over Rome after news of the mass execution. To him, the Baths massacre was the ultimate proof that imperial power had ceased to be an instrument of governance and had become a mechanism of absolute fear. Decades later, Cassius Dio, one of the senators who had survived the purge, recounted the event with a tone of bitter resignation. His writings reveal the conviction that the Senate no longer held any value. We were invited to banquets, and ended as victims. His words resonated as a warning to future generations. Politics in Rome was no longer decided in assemblies or debates, but in the shadows of palaces and in torture chambers disguised as marble halls. For the Romans who still believed in the greatness of their civilization, the massacre was the point at which the line between civilization and barbarism broke. The Baths, a symbol of culture, health, and sociability, had been transformed into the scene of a blood ritual. What was meant to represent the empire's splendor ended up being its darkest metaphor. Modern historians see the massacre as a prelude to collapse. They point out that from that moment on, every emperor lived under the shadow of that inherited paranoia. The idea that allies could turn into executioners became the norm. And Rome, though still militarily powerful, began to devour itself from within. Today, those who visit the ruins of the Baths of Caracalla in Rome admire restored mosaics and majestic arches. But beneath those stones lies an uncomfortable truth. There, one April morning in 217, 15 of the most powerful men of the aristocracy were reduced to unrecognizable corpses by the whim of a paranoid emperor. The story of the Baths massacre is not just a dark chapter of the past. It is an eternal reminder that absolute power never needs external enemies to destroy itself. Its own paranoia is enough. If this story shook you as much as it did me while reconstructing it, subscribe and leave a like so more people can discover the darkest corners of Roman history. And tell me in the comments, do you think Macrinus was an inevitable monster of his time, or an ordinary man corrupted by power?